She stepped off the stagecoach in Fort Worth wearing white gloves and a silk dress, and he stood there in mud-caked boots holding a sign that read, "Future Wife." Neither said a word, because what they'd each written in those letters, every single word was a lie. Fort Worth, Texas, 1882. The cattle drives had just begun turning this dusty crossroads into something that almost resembled a city, if you squinted hard enough and ignored the smell. Caleb Hargrove had been ranching the land north of the Trinity River for 7 years. He was lean, sun-worn, and built for labor rather than conversation. He had never once in those 7 years been mistaken for a gentleman. His letter to the matrimonial agency had described him as a prosperous cattleman with a well-appointed homestead and a comfortable lifestyle. This was generous. His house had 3 rooms, 2 of which leaked when it rained. His cattle operation existed, technically. The well-appointed homestead was a pine-board structure that the wind challenged every single night and sometimes won. Caleb needed one thing: someone who could cook, manage a household, and survive Texas without falling apart. He was not looking for love. He was looking for someone to keep him alive through winter. In Boston, Massachusetts, Vivian Alcott had written her own letter. She was 24 years old, educated at a finishing school her father could no longer afford, and living with her aunt in an arrangement that was politely described as temporary and realistically described as desperate. Her letter mentioned her expertise in domestic management and household arts. What it did not mention was that Vivian had never cooked a meal in her life, not once, not even tea. The stagecoach from the rail depot pulled into Fort Worth on a Wednesday morning. Caleb stood at the edge of the street holding a hand-lettered sign. He had washed his shirt. He had combed his hair. He was doing his absolute best. Vivian stepped down. She was holding a hat box and wearing an expression that said she had expected something considerably more than this. Caleb's first thought, she's beautiful. His second thought, she's wearing white gloves in Fort Worth. His third thought, I have made a catastrophic error. Vivian's first thought, where is the town? His second thought, that is the town. The wagon ride north from Fort Worth took 2 hours. They did not speak for the first 40 minutes. The prairie rolled out in every direction, brown and gold and enormous, and Vivian sat straight-backed on the wagon bench and watched it and said nothing. She had never seen that much sky in her life. Caleb finally said, the ranch is called the Rocking H, 700 acres, about 300 head of longhorn. Vivian said, 700 acres. She said it the way someone says a number they cannot picture. He said, spreads out west toward the creek, good grazing land. She said nothing. She was looking at a coyote watching them from a ridge. She had never seen a coyote before. The homestead appeared at the end of a rutted track through mesquite scrub. It was exactly what Caleb had promised. A house, a barn, a well, a chicken yard. It was not exactly what Vivian had imagined. The house sat low on the land as if it were slowly accepting defeat. The porch leaned. The roof had been patched in 3 places with what appeared to be flattened tin cans. She got down from the wagon without help. She walked to the door. She went inside. She stood in the main room, which contained a table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove that had seen considerable suffering, and a single shelf holding a Bible and a can of axle grease. She said, your letter mentioned a comfortable homestead. Caleb said, it's comfortable compared to sleeping outside, she said. That is not a useful comparison. That first evening, she attempted supper. She had told the agency she was experienced in domestic arts. She had meant she had observed domestic arts closely and with great attention while servants performed them. She now understood there was a difference. The cornbread was raw in the middle. The beans burned on the outside and were cold within. The coffee, she did not know what had happened to the coffee, but it was not coffee anymore. Caleb ate every bite. He did not say a single word. He washed the dishes himself. Vivian sat at the table, looked at her hands, and made a decision. What Caleb did not know about Vivian Alcott was that she had not chosen Texas. Texas had chosen her by process of elimination. Her father, Edmund Alcott, had been a successful importer in Boston, linens, fine china, English woolens. He had been successful until 1880, when a fire took his warehouse and the insurance policy he had believed he owned turned out to contain a clause he had not read carefully enough. The spring of 1881, the house was sold, the servants were dismissed, and the Alcott family was surviving on the goodwill of her Aunt Harriet in a townhouse in Beacon Hill that smelled permanently of cats. Vivian's 2 older sisters had married well before the collapse. Vivian had not. She was educated, presentable, and entirely without prospects, because prospects required a dowry, and the dowry was now someone else's warehouse. The matrimonial agency had been her idea, not because she wanted a husband in Texas, because she wanted to stop being a footnote in someone else's household. She had expected, based on Caleb's letter, which had used words like prosperous and comfortable, something rustic but livable. A proper house, a man with education, perhaps a bookshelf. She had arrived to find a tin patch roof and an axle grease can standing in for literature. That first night after Caleb was asleep, she went out to the porch and sat on the step that didn't creak and looked at the Texas sky. It was staggering. More stars than she had ever seen, crowded from horizon to horizon, impossibly bright over an impossibly flat land. She thought, this is either the most beautiful thing I have ever seen or the loneliest. She thought, perhaps both. In the morning, she was in the kitchen at 5 o'clock when Caleb came down. She said, teach me everything. How to use this stove, how to cook on it, how to keep this house. I can learn anything if someone shows me. I have an excellent memory. Caleb looked at her. He had ordered a woman who could already do these things. He had received a woman who could not do any of them but was standing in his kitchen in the gray Texas dawn, asking to learn. He said, you really can't cook, she said, not even slightly. But I intend to fix that immediately. Subscribe for more true frontier stories, real grit, real people, real Texas. New episodes every week. The next 3 months were an education in both directions. Vivian learned to cook on a wood-burning stove, which was nothing like the gas range in her aunt's Boston kitchen, and was in fact closer to managing a small, unpredictable fire that happened to have a flat top. The cornbread improved from inedible to edible in the first week. By the end of October, it was good. By November, 3 of Caleb's ranch hands, Wallace, a taciturn man from Tennessee, Domingo, who had ridden with cattle drives since he was 14, and Pete, who was 17 and eternally optimistic, had started arriving at the main house on any excuse that might result in being fed. She learned to milk the cow, which was a process involving considerably more negotiation than she had anticipated, as the cow, a large roan named Bess, had opinions about timing and expressed them physically. She learned to preserve tomatoes, cure salt pork, and render lard. She learned that bread required not just ingredients, but a kind of patience she had never been asked to develop before. Her hands blistered, they healed. They blistered again and healed differently. Tougher, more capable, unfamiliar to her when she looked at them in lamplight. Caleb was learning things too, though he would not have described it that way. He had not had a woman in this house in 7 years, and what he had expected was someone who would manage its domestic necessities with quiet efficiency. What he got was someone who asked questions constantly. Why did he brand the cattle on the left flank? What was the difference between a long horn and a short horn in terms of winter hardiness? Why did the mesquite bloom in April and not in May? He answered every question. He had not realized he knew so many things until someone asked him. He had been living here alone long enough that his knowledge had started to feel like furniture, always there, never examined. In the evenings, Vivian read aloud. She had brought one book from Boston, a collection of poetry by Tennyson, the only thing she had owned that she could not leave behind. Caleb sat by the stove and listened. He had not heard poetry read aloud since he was a boy in Virginia. He did not tell her this, he just listened. By November, Vivienne could run the household. By December, she was running it better than Caleb ever had. She reorganized the pantry, which had previously operated on a system Caleb described as I know where things are and which she described as optimistic. She patched the roof's worst gap with doubled canvas she had Wallace sew together. She mended every piece of clothing on the ranch. Caleb's, the hands, even the spare work shirts folded in the chest that hadn't been touched in years. She also did things no one had asked her to do. She noticed that Domingo, who had ridden cattle drives through the worst of Texas weather, had a persistent cough that worsened in cold air. She brewed him a tonic from dried herbs she'd found in the pantry and read about in the almanac. He stopped coughing within a week. He told her she had saved his life. She told him not to be dramatic. He told her he was not being dramatic. She noticed that young Pete was trying to teach himself to read from the labels on supply cans. She began teaching him in the evenings, 20 minutes at a time after supper. By Christmas, he could read a full page of text without stopping. Caleb watched all of this and said nothing, but he was watching. He had also begun, in the evenings when Vivian read, to listen to the words themselves rather than just the sound of her voice. There was a poem she read twice in 1 week, something about the sea and loss and the passage of time. He did not understand all of it, but there was a line that stayed with him about how it was better to have loved and lost, and he sat with that line for 3 days before he realized it was making him uncomfortable, because he had never loved anything enough to lose it. He built her a bookshelf. He was not a skilled carpenter. The shelf was crooked, and the joints were visible, and one of the supports was slightly shorter than the other. He put it on the wall next to the window anyway. Vivian looked at it for a long time. She said, "It's crooked." Caleb said, "I know." She put the Tennyson on it. She wrote to her aunt in Boston and asked for every book the family hadn't sold. 11 books arrived by January, transported on the Fort Worth freight wagon. She shelved them by subject. Caleb read 2 of them before spring. The norther hit in late January. They called them blue northers in Texas. Storms that came down from the panhandle in a wall of blue-gray cloud and dropped the temperature by 40 degrees in the time it took to ride from the barn to the house. This one arrived on a Tuesday night without meaningful warning. By midnight, the temperature had fallen to 12 degrees, and Caleb's prize heifer, a shorthorn he had paid $60 for in Abilene, which was the most he had paid for any animal in his life, went into labor in the barn. She was in trouble. The calf was wrong positioned. Caleb had delivered dozens of calves, but not alone, not in 12-degree cold, not with this particular animal who he needed to survive. He did not ask Vivian to come. She was a banker's daughter from Boston, and this was not her world, and it was 12 degrees and she was asleep, and he did not ask. She came anyway. She had heard the barn door. She put on 2 wool skirts, Caleb's heavy coat off the hook, and every pair of stockings she owned, and she walked out into the blue norther, carrying a lantern because the barn had 1 lamp and Caleb needed both hands. The work was not quiet. Caleb worked in near silence, hands deep in the labor of it, jaw set. Vivian held the lantern and did not look away and did not move. Her fingers went numb around the handle. She held it anyway. The calf arrived at midnight. It hit the hay breathing hard and shaking, and Caleb caught it in his arms and held it against his chest and breathed on it the way you breathe on something you are trying to keep alive. He looked at Vivian. Her face was white with cold. Her hands were locked around the lantern in a grip that would not release. He took the lantern. He took her hands. He cupped them in both of his and breathed warm air onto her fingers, one by one until they could move again. He said, "You didn't have to come out." She said, "You needed a third hand." He said, "I did." She said, "Well, now you have one." Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe now and follow Vivian and Caleb through every storm. New Frontier stories drop every week. They stood in the barn for a while after, neither moving toward the door. The calf had found its footing. The mother was calm. The blue norther pushed at the barn walls and the lantern swayed. Vivian said, "Your letter said prosperous cattleman." Caleb said, "Your letter said experienced in domestic arts." Vivian said, "I had supervised people who performed domestic arts. I considered that equivalent." Caleb said, "I had $60 worth of cattle and 3 rooms that leaked. I considered that prosperous." She looked at him. "We are both terrible liars," he said. "We are," she said. "I would not change my letter." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I would not change mine." She asked him why. He said he wasn't sure he could explain it exactly, but that if they had both been honest, they probably wouldn't have come. And then this, whatever this was, wouldn't exist. The calf in the hay, the 11 books on a crooked shelf, Pete reading by lamplight, Domingo's cough gone quiet, the smell of cornbread in a house that had smelled like a man living alone for 7 years. He said, "I ordered a cook. I got a library." Vivian said, "I ordered a gentleman. I got a man who breathes on frozen fingers at midnight." He said, "Is that worse?" She considered it with the seriousness she brought to everything. She said, "No, I think it may be considerably better." They walked back to the house through the norther. The stars were gone. The wind was enormous. They walked shoulder to shoulder because the path was narrow, and somewhere between the barn and the front step, his hand found hers in the dark. Neither of them said anything about it. Neither of them let go. They were married in March of 1883 by a Methodist preacher who came up from Fort Worth on a circuit. The ceremony was held on the porch of the rocking H because the main room was too small for the people who came. Vivian wore a dress she had sewn herself from blue wool she'd ordered from the general store in town. Caleb wore the shirt he had washed when she arrived, which had improved somewhat with a second washing. Wallace and Domingo and Pete stood to one side. The Norwegian neighbor from 3 miles east, a man named Halvor Bjornsson, who rarely spoke but who had been quietly helping Caleb fix fences for years, stood to the other side and wept openly throughout the ceremony, which no one commented on because Halvor was the closest thing Caleb had ever had to a friend, and everyone understood. The preacher asked if they had written their own vows. Caleb said he had tried, but he wasn't much with words. Vivian said she had written something. She said, "I came expecting a gentleman rancher. I found a man who builds crooked bookshelves and breathes life back into frozen things. I came expecting to be useful. I found something I did not know how to want. I intend to spend the rest of my life figuring out what to call it. The preacher looked at Caleb. Caleb said what she said, all of it. They turned 700 acres into 400 over the next 10 years. They brought in irrigation from the Trinity tributary. They built a proper house with a wood floor that Caleb laid himself, badly at first, then better. Vivian ran the household and eventually ran the books for the operation, which she reorganized with the same calm efficiency she had brought to the pantry. Pete learned to read, then to write, then became the postmaster of a small town 12 miles west, which Vivian considered her finest achievement, and Caleb considered proof that you never knew what you were growing until it was grown. Domingo worked the rocking H until he was 63. The cough never came back. He told Vivian once that the tonic had worked, but what had actually kept him was that someone had noticed. Caleb Hargrove died in 1917 at the age of 61. It was not a dramatic death. He had lived hard years, and his heart gave out in the barn on a warm September morning, and Vivian found him there sitting against the stall where the Abilene heifer had calved 34 years before. She did not move him for a long time. She sat with him in the barn the way she had stood with him through every storm, still steady, holding whatever needed to be held. Vivian lived until 1931. She was 73. Every evening until the end, she read aloud from the shelf that had grown to fill an entire wall of the rocking H. Tennyson was still there on the left end, where it had always been. Beside it, 40 years of books, history, science, poetry, 3 novels from a catalog, a book on Texas birds she had ordered after seeing something in the mesquite she couldn't name. She taught her 3 children to read before they were 5. She taught them to work before they were 7. She taught them the difference between what a letter says and what a life requires. Her youngest daughter once asked her, "Mama, were you happy here?" Vivian thought about it for a long time. She said, "I was honest here. I think that turned out to be the same thing. They had both lied to get here. They had both told the truth to stay. She came expecting a gentleman rancher. He came expecting someone who could cook. What they built instead, out of burned cornbread and blue northers, and a crooked bookshelf, and a calf born breathing in 12 degrees, was stronger than either of them had written in their letters, because they had never been writing about the ranch. They had been writing about the hope of not being alone, and that part at least was true. If Vivian and Caleb's story reached you, subscribe. Every week, I tell the true stories of the people who built the West with nothing but grit, lies, and the stubborn refusal to quit. Click subscribe and ride along. These stories are waiting for you.